Chapter 14. Strange Steve. The old doctor bent 9-year-old Steve over the end of his examination table. He pointed a small flashlight into the opening of a speculum he had just inserted into Steve. Then the old doctor frowned. He spent a little while poking around inside Steve's rectum and took a few flash pictures with a newfangled Polaroid instant camera. Finally, he had Steve pull up his pants and sent him out to be with his parents. Joe and Rosie left Steve in the waiting room and met with the doctor in his office. The doctor looked at the couple gravely and said, "I've examined Steve, and I am surprised to find that your son is actually also a female. Your son is intersex, which means he retains features of both a boy and a girl. I know this is a bit shocking, but you must have noticed some girlish behavior at one time or another, did you not?" Joe just stared at the old doc and shook his head. "That is not possible," he declared and hung his head. Rosie began to cry quietly. Joe became confused and non-communicative. Rosie took over and thanked the doctor for his examination and for his instructions on preparing their son to either stay a boy or become a girl. She looked mortified as Joe asked her again in the parking lot just what had transpired. She found she had to tell him again and again, because he would completely forget the doctor's diagnosis within less than a minute. Joe had very real, instant, and long-lasting selective memory. Steve and Clyde were the same, about instantly and firmly forgetting anything found subconsciously unacceptable, a rare component of high-functioning autism. "Look, Joe, the doctor just told us that Steve is both a boy and a girl. He has both sets of genital parts. We have to find out which he really is, so they can do surgery. This is because our Steve has a penis, but he also has a girl's parts," Rosie explained. On the long 100-mile drive back to the High Plains, Rosie tried to explain everything the doctor had told her about what to do for Steve. She explained to Steve that she would follow the doctor's instructions, which would entail Steve needing to play with girls' toys and trying to wear girls' clothes. Steve made it clear he'd be wearing no girls' clothes. He was fine with having a doll to dress, the paper dolls to dress, and the little working plastic sewing machine that his mother said she would get for him. Rosie followed the doctor's orders and bought a Betsy Wetsy doll, a set of paper dolls, and a plastic sewing machine. She also sewed some girls' clothes and tried to get Steve to try a plain blue dress on that she had made. He flatly refused. But he gladly played with the dolls and eagerly learned to sew, knit, cook, and a few other girl-designated experiments his mother devised. Joe was aghast whenever he saw Steve playing with any of it, and Rosie was careful to work with Steve while Joe was off writing and working. She was very unhappy with Joe's attitude. Whenever he would reacquire the knowledge that their oldest son was a hermaphrodite, he would bitterly cuss. He would complain, "He's a GD sissy. Got a damned girly boy. Nobody around here is going to put up with this. He'll probably never amount to anything." Rosie tried to shield Steve from his father as best she could. "I can't rightly see how your old daddy will ever accept you as a girl. You know, he said he always wanted to have a girl instead of a boy. We were going to name you Amy if you were a girl. I guess we could still change your name to Amy, if that's what you really want. Don't worry about your daddy. He will come around, don't worry," she encouraged Steve. She tried several times in various ways to get through to Steve that he had to make a decision about whether he would stay a boy or soon have surgery to become a girl. Steve always forgot everything that she said after less than a minute. As with many events in his life, Steve always forgot the whole issue completely, just as his father did, as to why he was playing with dolls, what this whole confusion about whether he was a girl or a boy was about, and even that he liked the doll very much. He did not feel at all comfortable in girls' clothes, however. Unfortunately, Rosie also had a version of selective memory, much slower, but every bit as complete in forgetting. One day a few months later, Rosie saw Steve playing with her Betsy Wetsy doll, as she often had for over 2 months. Rosie could no longer remember that Steve was intersex. Her autistic selective memory was slower and weaker than her husband's and her son's version of it. Still, she had eventually completely forgotten that Steve was diagnosed as intersex. One day she came in from feeding the chickens and turkeys she was raising and saw Steve changing a play diaper on his Betsy Wetsy doll. Rosie angrily walked up to him and demanded, "Steve Gandy, just where did you get this doll? Where did you get such a thing? You better not have stolen it." Steve became angry whenever that happened. He could remember things and think clearly. As soon as he felt very angry, he remembered everything. "But Mom, you gave me this doll. You said I needed to play with it," Steve insisted. Rosie could not understand what Steve was saying. She cussed and took the doll away from Steve. He never saw it again. She also took away all the other girl things, but Steve physically protected the plastic sewing machine from her. "No, this is my sewing machine. It is mine," he declared. One day, about 6 months later, an official letter came in the U.S. mail. Rosie opened it up, read it, and was clearly perplexed. She showed Joe the letter at supper. It was an official letter from a medical doctor whose name no one recognized. The wording about Steve and how he needed some kind of sex surgery confused and angered them. They turned to Steve and both asked, "Are you feeling sick, Steve? Do you know what all this nonsense is about?" Since he felt no threat to himself, Steve did not become angry. Thus, he was unable to remember any of the issue at all. He decided that his folks were playing a silly joke on him. He smiled and said, "No, I don't need any surgery. I don't need no doctor. I feel fine." Rosie threw the doctor's letter in the trash, bound for the backyard incinerator ring. And thus, Steve grew up with both sets of genitals and all the hormonal confusion that entailed, never remembering until he was well into middle age that he was a neglected hermaphrodite, and in his old age he saw this as a blessing. Because, although sexual assignment was the normal medical response for many decades, later research and anecdotal evidence showed that this surgery was just part of the paranoid, xenophobic, controlling response to anyone very different, and it was entirely unnecessary. Intersex people now consider themselves either neither or both. For Steve, it was both. Removing genitals does not make the man or the woman. Steve finally was able to always remember and accepted himself as an old she-male, who had always been both. He did mostly identify in public as male, and he was actually both, and valued both sides of himself and herself nearly equally. After coming out publicly, she did go so far as to allow the female half the self-expression of painting a couple of her left fingernails with a bright blue polish. Joe, like many high-functioning autistic people, called Asperger's syndrome for a time, held very different and much more intelligent views on many issues compared with his peers. For instance, by the time he was in his 30s, he opposed the view of all his surrounding family, friends, and neighbors who were all very much attached to all their guns, including many types of handguns. Although he did not openly share his personal views with others whenever they were in conflict with their views, he held his own counsel and was never swayed by the views of others. Joe owned several large rifles and a shotgun. He owned no handguns. Steve saw pistols that his friends brought to grade school and decided he needed a pistol. Bringing guns to school was not a problem, unless a student displayed one, in which case the teacher might keep the gun for the day and return it to the student before they got on the bus. This was on the high plains in the 1960s. Not only were there no rules against having firearms of any type at school, grade school or otherwise, the public schools in Colorado actually taught rifle training and rifle safety in the 4th grade as part of the local curriculum, but only to the boys. Steve told himself while riding the school bus home to the ranch one afternoon that there was no reason why he too could not have at least a .22 caliber pistol. Almost every rancher's kid at school had at least one such handgun, given to him by his parents, usually as a birthday or a Christmas present. That night at dinner, Steve made his request. "I saw Denny's new pistol at school today, Dad. I want me a pistol. Can I get one for Christmas, please?" he asked Joe carefully. Joe looked down at Steve closely for a few seconds and then responded, "Oh, bughouse. No, Steve, I am not buying you any pistol. In fact, I guess I've never said it to you before, but your mother knows. I don't want any pistols in this house. Ever. Period." Joe went back to eating his dinner, the subject handled. Rosie noticed how crushed Steve looked and leaned over to him and whispered, "Your daddy doesn't like short guns, Steve, but you can ask him for something else for Christmas. Just make it something Santa Claus can bring that won't cost him too much." Steve was angry. He grouched about it a little and refused to finish his dinner, passive-aggressively sitting on his hands and frowning at his plate. Joe noticed and frowned at him. He raised his voice slightly as he stated, "No pistols in this house, and that's final," he growled. That Christmas, still hoping his father would change his mind, he eagerly opened smaller presents, hoping to find the object of his desire. Not finding one, he frowned as he opened a long, skinny present, and was relatively happy to find the next best thing to a pistol. It was a hand-pumped, air-powered BB gun. When he took it to school on the bus, the boys made fun of how it was not a real gun, but a toy BB gun. It wasn't cool enough for them. Steve always saw it as a consolation prize and told himself he would own a pistol someday. However, when he grew to be an adult, he was considering opposing his father's rule and buying himself a gun. He thought to ask Joe one day while visiting him why he was so opposed to handguns. Without missing a beat, Joe replied, "It's for 3 simple reasons." These he proceeded to list. "A pistol is too easy to grab and shoot in anger. They are too easy to miss point. You can shoot yourself accidentally real easy. And worst of all, little kids can find them and shoot themselves or you, 'cause they don't know what a weapon is yet. Guns are only for killing, nothing else, Steve. Stick to only having rifles like I do, and you will live longer. Rifles are effective self-defense and necessary for hunting big game." Adult Steve thought this over for a few weeks, still planning to buy himself a particular 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Finally, his father's logic won out. Steve bought a semi-automatic assault rifle instead. In fact, he never actually owned any handgun, although he did come to own several rifles and one shotgun of his own. It was one of the rare instances where one of his father's personal philosophies became his own. In the spring of 1970, the Stilson Ranch, where Joe worked and his family lived after returning from Canada, calved out a record number of cattle. They raised pulled Herefords and needed every hand available to work with so many new additions to the herd. Joe was nearly 50. After a calf had been born one cold morning, Steve asked his old daddy what the puddle of bloody flesh steaming on the ground was near the cow. Joe explained that it was all that remained of the calf's life inside the mother. He said, "It's her afterbirth. She'll come around in a little bit and eat it. Don't worry about that. It's just part of life for all us mammals." Steve grimaced and stared warily at the afterbirth and decided calves being born was too disgusting to think about. "It's just cows that have this, though, right, Dad?" Steve asked hopefully. "No, like I told you, all animals have an afterbirth. Did you know we are mammals too?" Joe asked. Steve frowned and replied, "Well, we are no animals. We are people. We are not animals." Joe chuckled and said, "Sorry to have to break it to you, but we are animals too. When you were born, there was a little bit of afterbirth, just like that cow's. But human mothers do not eat their afterbirth. There's an old cowboy joke about it. Well, see, one old cowboy congratulates another old cowboy on the birth of his new kid. Then the first cowboy asks if there was any problem with the birth. The second cowboy says, 'Nope, it went fine, except I had a hell of a time getting the old lady to eat the afterbirth.'" Steve just stared at Joe and said nothing. "Well, see, it's a joke, 'cause women don't eat the afterbirth," Joe explained. Steve tried hard to laugh, but the subject was abhorrent to him. Joe shook his head and said, "Well, son, it's all part of every life. You'll understand someday. And I told you about an afterbirth because I can see you're old enough to help out now. We have to start cutting and branding the calves today. You can watch and learn. Then you can start helping me with it. Your mama has breakfast ready. Let's go eat." and then you can come help old Daddy.